Hello and welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. It is Sunday, November 14th, 2021. Yes, the year is slowly and gradually drawing to a close. But before we get to Christmas, before we get to Thanksgiving, before we get to the end of the year, we still have 3 more races to go. Mark, what a weekend it was at Interlagos in Sao Paulo, Brazil. But before we get to that, how was your weekend? I know you're busy getting ready, packing bags and getting everything ready for your trip. You look shockingly refreshed and awake. I don't know if this is a facade, but, props to you for keeping it together, at least outwardly.
So I really appreciate those kind words. I'm looking at myself in the camera right now, and I certainly look a lot better than I feel inside. I feel a little bit frazzled, and it feels like collectively, you and I have lived now in a 90-day long monsoon. I cannot even remember the last time we strung more than 2 nice days together. So it's been dark, it's been wet. Now, selfishly, I'm excited that I'm on the verge of escaping that. But other than that, the weekend was yeah, I would, my friend, I would love to have some adult company on this trip. But the weekend was kind of blah, it was a lot of getting ready, that typical anxiousness and anxiety before any kind of trip. And of course, it's compounded a little bit by the fact that there's these COVID protocols and doing PCR tests, all that kind of stuff. But that aside, we are good to fly on Tuesday. We will be there in time to record with you for our normal Thursday night session, which typically drops for most of our listeners on Friday morning. But I am doing fantastic. But I've got a question for you before we even get started. Actually, you know what? Before the question, I have a reminder. Okay. So the reminder is, if you don't know and you haven't been listening, our first annual Scuderia F1 poster contest comes to a close on Thursday. We will be drawing not 1, not 2, but 3 winners because we've had more than 150 retweets. Now, if some miracle happens and we get to 200 by Thursday, we will draw 4 winners. My poor bank account will draw 4 winners, but we will be doing that live during the live stream next Thursday. If you're not able to join us, you'll be able to hear it on the Friday podcast, and then we'll announce it via Twitter on Friday night. We want to give those people that tune in and those people that listen to the podcast the first opportunity to find out if they did or didn't win. But before that, or I guess after that, my first question for you is, you and I have agreeably, as we tend to be with most things, come to the conclusion that sprint qualifying has a little bit of work to do. The FIA, Formula One, Liberty, it's not perfect. There's something there. We can build on it. It's not perfect, but we don't hate it, but we don't love it. After this weekend, what is your thought on sprint qualifying Grand Prix weekends?
Yeah, I thought it worked this weekend. I don't know if this like the planets aligned or something just happened, but there was so much drama happening both on and off the track that there was just so much going on. I mean, whoever thought? Like, I mean, on Thursday night when we sat down, we did the preview show. Whoever thought that Lewis Hamilton, of all people, would be excluded for a technical infringement on the flexi wing? Who thought that Max would be fined 50 large for manhandling, getting his greasy mitts all over Lewis's car? Parc Fermé, Lewis being excluded from qualifying, Max getting in trouble. I mean, it's just like, it's been an awesome season, but there's been some weird stuff. There's been some drama, but I never expected any of that. I mean, considering that Red Bull were the ones that were kind of the ones that were the, I guess, the chief suspect, primary suspect about the flexi wing way back in Portugal earlier this year. I never thought at some point that somebody would be getting busted for it. I never thought it would be Lewis and Mercedes, but it was just it was a great weekend. It really, really was. It was enjoyable.
It was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And I know we're probably due for a break because my preamble was 10 minutes of poster talk, but I agree. And we talked a little bit about this on Thursday, that this weekend, it's complex. It was compounded by the fact that there was freight issues. Maybe there could be some unexpected drama, some unexpected tension. And ultimately, the good news is, while there was a lot of drama, the tensions didn't necessarily boil over like we saw at Silverstone, like we saw after Monza. It was contained, it was compact. That's good. But boy, was it an entertaining weekend. As a whole, it was entertaining. And whether the sprint qualifying format is perfect or not, and I don't think it's there yet, I was absolutely glued to my phone and my computer all day Friday, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, even post race. I couldn't get enough of the analysis and the spaces chats and the Twitter commentary. If the sprint qualifying weekend sets out to glue people to however they consume Formula One over the course of a 3-day weekend, rather than maybe Wednesday or Friday, Saturday afternoon when qualifying happens, and then the Grand Prix on Sunday. If the intention is to create a more compelling 3-day package, it certainly accomplished it with
Mhm.
Brazil. Sao
Yeah,
Paulo,
totally.
Sao Paulo.
Yeah, so probably, I totally spaced on that as well because I
Me
put
too. Me
Brazil
too.
GP like a preview for the Thursday show, and then I realized today, hey, we're not actually calling it Brazil anymore. We're calling it the Sao Paulo Grand Prix. But hey, whatever. Splitting hairs here. And I should just preface before we get any further into the show that you know, regardless what we talk about and our opinions here, we're not pro anti Max. We're not pro anti Lewis. We're going to
So
try
true.
and be as objective as we can. So please don't come for us on Twitter. Please don't come for us on the emails. If you feel like we're disrespecting your boy, it's just we're trying to be as objective as we can. But it certainly was a lot of fun to watch. I mean, I thought that we're unabashed homers when it comes to the North American drivers. That's out there. But I thought that the love that Lewis was getting on the Sky Sports feed was pretty obvious at the end of the race. I mean, it was quite a phenomenal achievement what he did. Having to start from the back of the grid in the sprint from qualifying, and then the five grid place penalty for the ice change, still qualifying 10th, and then the way he carved his way through the field. I mean, it was a phenomenal weekend for Lewis Hamilton, just considering all the adversity, all the challenges that he had to face and he had to deal with. Max, I thought, on the other hand, I thought he was very pragmatic about it in defeat. I thought he was fairly classy about it. Just, you know what, we just didn't have the speed. And I mean, the way that Lewis blew past him was pretty impressive. And I mean, we'll talk about the move on Max. I mean, yeah, that was kind of pushing your luck a little bit. I mean, it was noted by the stewards, and let's not forget that this is a guy that actually had a rule created because of his blocking maneuvers under braking, in the past. So there's that. But before we get into it, let's do what we usually wait until the very end after we've completely broken down the entire race. So
Race
yeah, we're
classification.
going to do the race classification up front so everybody's not all confused and wondering what the heck is going on. So the top 10 finishers at Sao Paulo, not Brazil, Sao Paulo Grand Prix: Lewis Hamilton winning, Max Verstappen second, Valtteri Bottas in third, Sergio Perez in the second, Red Bull fourth, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz fifth and sixth for Ferrari. Boy, did that third place battle in the constructors really flip on its head this weekend.
Oof.
Pierre Gasly in seventh for the Alpha Tauri, Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso coming home eighth and ninth for a pretty decent outing for the Alpines. And then Lando Norris, the sole and lone sad McLaren driver, squeaking into the top 10. So you have that. Now, the Drivers' Championship is where it gets interesting. Max Verstappen, 332 and a half points, leading Lewis, who has 318 and a half. So I was going to say Sergio Bottas. That's some weird mashup that just nobody ever asked for. Valtteri Bottas, on the other hand, he has 203 points. Sergio Perez, the real Sergio Perez, he has 178. Lando, the fact that he only collected a single point today, distanced a little bit in that race for fourth place, and Lando now has 151 points. And before we start talking more about the race in detail, let's look at the constructors. Still pretty close, although Mercedes did eke out and open up that gap a little bit. 521 and a half for the Silver Arrows, 11 and a half points ahead of Red Bull, who have 510 and a half. Ferrari 287 and a half compared to McLaren, who now have 256. So that one not over, but certainly not the weekend that McLaren wanted at Interlagos. And then Alpine rounding out the top five in the Constructors' Championship. So yeah, interesting. And I must admit that the sprint qualifying was a nice surprise because I took Friday afternoon off and was able to sit down. I'm like, oh my gosh, appointment television. Let's sit down and get this thing going. Of course, I thought it was interesting too because I don't know if this is just me because I have a proven and documented history of not paying attention to graphics and branding, but I did notice that the race, the sprint qualifying was actually called sprint. It seemed like to me they dropped the qualifying from it. So
Hmm.
I know I'll be probably put on blast because last weekend, even though the tongue was planted firmly in cheek when I was mentioning about how was it Yuki's camera or whose camera it was, so it was looked like there was some footage missing. I was just kidding about that being a conspiracy theory. Anyways, I think that the branding that is legit, that they did drop the qualifying from it, which I think it would make a big difference to it. Just kind of going back full circle to what you were saying a few minutes ago, Mark, because I couldn't help that if they just got away from the whole idea of sprint qualifying and just called it a sprint race. I think that's just mentally and psychologically, I think we'd all look at it in a completely different light and probably embrace it in a completely different way. But perhaps maybe that's the way it's going to evolve here on out.
Definitely. I'm still convinced that there's work to do here, but I kind of liked your point at the beginning, which is maybe the stars aligned a little bit here. But I also heard something in another podcast tonight that kind of resonated with me a little bit. And it was maybe the reason the sprint qualifying session was so compelling, so dramatic, and so fun is because you had a ton of overtakes. And the reason you had
Mhm.
a ton of overtakes is because Lewis Hamilton was planted firmly at the back of the grid because he was disqualified from qualifying on Friday. And maybe there's some value in continuing that conversation about fitting reverse grid sprint races into the calendar. And I'm not convinced. I'm still not of the mind. I can't wrap my North American brain around the fact that you would have a race worth points, but you would award teams that underperform relative to their peers. So I still can't wrap my head around that. But I do agree that one of the reasons that session was so fun is because there was so much overtaking, and there was a ton of overtaking, like I said, because Lewis Hamilton was firmly planted at the back of the grid. So, for whatever reason, for all of the different things or reasons that we can talk about, this reason was compelling, it was fun, and it was exciting. And, it really comes down to this. And if I'm going to recap Lewis's weekend in a nutshell, it kind of looks like this. He gets his 101st race win, which neither of us for even a second predicted was a possibility coming into this race weekend. For me, at least, because I don't want to speak for you, but for me, at least, this Grand Prix was all about damage limitation. You're potentially going to go into 3 tracks, 2 of which we've never raced on before, but we're going to go into 3 tracks at race level. Going to be a little bit humid, but they should be dry. They should play into Mercedes' strengths, especially with some of the straights that we're going to see in Abu Dhabi and Jeddah, especially. So this weekend was about damage limitation. Lewis Hamilton, and if you look at his weekend, he scores his 101st Grand Prix victory. It's his first win since, I guess, if we have to go back to Sochi, it feels
Yeah.
like it's
Yeah.
been an eternity. And despite that, he's, like you said earlier, only 11 points behind, 14 points behind in the WDC right now. It's remarkable. But his weekend looks like this. The freight shows up late. He gets to Brazil after a short week, after an intense battle in Mexico. He qualifies first on Friday evening. He's promptly disqualified, but we don't know that he's disqualified basically until halfway through free practice 2 on the Saturday. So the entire Formula One world's left sitting in tension and anxiety overnight, trying to understand what happens. Parallel to that, there's this entire drama associated with the fact that fan footage shows Max Verstappen touching his car in Parc Ferme, which is clearly against the rules. And if you look at the FIA international sporting code, it's clear that you can't, quote unquote, check or touch a competitor's car, really even your own. We find out, of course, on Saturday morning that he's been disqualified. He starts the sprint qualifying session in 20th after being disqualified, finds his way all the way up to 5th, but then he starts the Grand Prix in 10th because he took an internal combustion engine change, which we knew about a couple days before. But clearly, Mercedes were thinking this is probably the right place to do it because you're not going to be ultra competitive here, anyways. So he starts the Grand Prix in 10th. He carves his way through the field through the course of that 71 lap, ultimately dominates the Grand Prix, overtakes Max, which we'll talk about, and then just runs away with the race victory. And for me, and I tweeted this after the race, the reason that this weekend should be so special is for a lot of the folks that are new to Formula One, and maybe this is your first year, your second year, or third year, you've probably seen some really dominant Lewis performances, but you've probably never seen anything like this. And I think this is a good memory for everybody to have. Whether you're new to F1, it's good to be able to say, I saw that weekend in Brazil live in 2021 when he was trying to close the gap on the championship. And likewise, if you've been following Formula One for 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, this was a really great opportunity to remember and to recalibrate your expectations of what Lewis is capable of. Because I think for
Sure.
folks like you and me, we've seen Lewis dominate in 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, 20. And I think we've just taken it for granted and assumed that a lot of that is the team, the package, the strategy. It's all of that collectively. This weekend, obviously, they had a great package. The car was great. He had a fresh internal combustion engine, but his level of execution on track, both in terms of qualifying, which, you know what, correctly was wiped from the record books. He was disqualified correctly. I do not debate that for a second. He broke the rule. I don't think Mercedes intentionally broke a rule, but that was correct. But his performance in sprint qualifying and the race are amongst the best of all time. And I know
Oh
I'm
yeah.
going to get slack for that. And there's always some recency bias, which is a very North American term. But when you look at the weekend holistically, this was an epic package.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got some thoughts on that. I'll respond to it after we take a quick break here. So don't go away. We'll be back on the flip side. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. We are talking all about the 2021 Sao Paulo Grand Prix and the masterclass and the very, very impressive performance that we saw Lewis Hamilton put on, not just on Saturday, but also, sorry, on Sunday, but Saturday, also Friday. Really, really impressive. And sure, I totally agree with what you're saying, Mark, because that really was something special. I mean, you don't see something like that happen each and every day. And I couldn't help but thinking to myself, at this point, what is Lewis racing for? He's not racing for money. He's not racing for the reputation because he's already a 7-time world champion. Yes, he'd like to go out on top as the outright number one statistically best driver of all time. I mean, he already owns records, from coast to coast on the Formula One statistics and record book. But I mean, Schumacher and Lewis are tied on 7 world championships. And I don't think at this point it's completely lost on Lewis. The fact that he's even in this conversation has a lot to do, especially I know the one that he won, obviously previous before joining Mercedes, but I think especially this unprecedented run of success since 2014 and all the titles that he's rattled off since then. I think that Lewis, as much as he's racing for himself, to get that outright 8th championship and be the number one best driver, the king of the mountain in that regard, I think he's also very keenly aware that he's also racing for the people that designed the car, the people that built the car, the people that transports the equipment to the racetrack, his trainers, his nutrition, everybody that's part of the puzzle of Mercedes. I think that he's racing every much for them as he is for himself. I mean, you heard that little clip on race radio after about lap, what was it, 7, 8, whatever it was, when Lewis was in fourth and Valtteri moves past on turn 3, and then he starts that run to try and charge down Sergio and pass him there. They broadcast that whole thing. He said, thank you, Valtteri, after his teammate let him through, even though there's obviously team orders were going to be there. So I mean, he's aware of the big picture there, and I think that, like I say, as much as he's racing for himself, I think he's trying to win this one for everybody else as well.
Definitely. I think a big part of that, and I don't want to discredit Max, and I always have to tread a little bit cautiously when I get a little bit too maybe excitable or I flex a little bit too much on Lewis because there's so much tension within the Formula One community right now. But
Sure.
I think a big part of what you're speaking to is a byproduct of the fact that Lewis has been a part of that Mercedes team since the V8 era. And you recall, and I recall, because we probably had conversations about this with our friends, but when Lewis left McLaren, which was in a bit of internal disarray, especially with Ron Dennis running the show and just a few years clear of Spygate and some of the other things that team was unfortunately wrapped up in, when he departed McLaren and he went to Mercedes, it wasn't even remotely a slam dunk that it was going to be a successful transition. And I think a lot of people at time thought, hey, you know what? He's had a good career, and this is Lewis in 2012. He's had a good career. He's had a good run. He's in his mid to late 20s. He has a championship. He came close a second time. He's going to run out his career. He's going to run out the clock with Mercedes, and it's not going to be a successful project. He goes to Mercedes, and in 2013, this is the last year of the V8. They were relatively competitive. They certainly weren't competing for a title with the likes of Red Bull, but they were relatively competitive. But I think my point is he's been with that team since the very beginning of the journey that they went on following that. So he's been there with Toto this entire time. He's been there with the development of the V6 turbo hybrids. He's been there as we took that journey with the 2014 to 2016 cars. He was there as they developed, and he provided feedback on the 2017 cars. He is no doubt intimately familiar with the 2022 car because he's
Mhm.
probably seeing it and talking about it and providing feedback. And he's probably been there as long as most of the people in the two factories have been. So he's very much enmeshed and embedded in the fabric and the culture of that team. And I think one of the things that he does really well is he shows his appreciation to the team. And one of the things that we haven't seen as much because of COVID, but during off weeks, he would regularly go back to Brackley to celebrate titles and wins with the team at the factory. He's in the factory, he's around people. So he's well loved within that team. Max, meanwhile, is it's a little bit more difficult to kind of draw that point of comparison. He has been in Formula 1 for, I guess this is his 7th year at the
It's crazy,
premier
isn't it?
level. He's been with the Red Bull team for 6 years, or almost 6 full years with the Milton Keynes team. Now that team's been probably not as smooth and consistent as the Mercedes team, because obviously Mercedes supplies their own engines and they design all of their cars and their components internally, except for those parts that they have to buy externally. He with Max, he's been with that team. There's been some disruption there with Renault. That wasn't a good fit. They made the transition to Honda. I think he's still well respected. I just don't know that he's necessarily loved in the same way within that team as Lewis is. But then maybe I'm reading too much into this. And at the end of the day, all it takes to be loved within a team is to be able to deliver wins and be able
Mhm.
to deliver prize money, which obviously Max has been doing in spades this year.
You know, one thing I was thinking about this the other week when we were talking about Lewis. I think the previous time we talked about he's on the cusp of potentially winning an unparalleled and unprecedented eighth world championship. And I couldn't help but think about it again just now when you were just talking about the fact that when he left McLaren in 12, or sorry, 13, goes to Mercedes in 2014, just the gamble that it was. I mean, like you say, it was by no means a slam dunk that Mercedes was going to be not only just competitive, but this uber dominant, world beating team that nobody's going to be able to catch up and match for basically a
Nobody
decade.
saw that. Nobody.
And
And if they say they did, they're lying.
or they're just I should be giving that person a phone call to get me the winning lottery
Exactly.
numbers for next week. But I couldn't help but thinking, if it hadn't worked out, are we sitting here now having a completely different conversation as Lewis's career draws to a close, that maybe we're talking about him in a similar manner, but somewhat differently than Fernando Alonso, who won 2 world championships very early on in his career and then just was never able to deliver again. I mean, there's obviously a lot more going on with the whole Fernando Alonso story, but I mean, Fernando wins 2 championships in '05 and '06. Then Lewis, I mean, he comes into Formula One a couple of years later. He wins a championship fairly early on, and yeah, I mean, basically right away, right? And then, I mean, it takes him several more years to win that first one with
6?
Mercedes.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
crazy. It was a 6-year gap between
yep.
his Mercedes title and his McLaren title.
Yeah, I couldn't help but thinking that if that Mercedes gamble didn't pay off, I mean, Lewis might have just been a footnote to Formula One history. That
Yeah.
yeah, he was a very talented driver, but apart from that really early on success, he just never had the car. Was just never with the right team at the right time to deliver. I mean, obviously that's a conversation that we're not having in this reality in this universe, but it was something that
Do
it was one of those gambles that just paid off. Like everything just worked out. They just had the right people in all areas of that team.
Do you agree though? And I would credit Max in very much the same way because I think people are quick to discredit Lewis because he had a great car. And I'm so
Mhm,
sick of hearing that argument because what I don't think people realize is how involved the drivers are in the design and the development of the cars. They give endless streams of feedback to the engineers, to
mhm.
the designers, to the aerodynamicists, endless feedback that so much of what ends up on the track is based on the feedback that's coming from the driver. So I think sometimes you also hear this criticism of Red Bull in the sense that hey, they do a really good job of building a car for Max. I
Mhm.
don't necessarily think that's true. I just think Max is able to give them incredibly strategic, tactical feedback, and they're able to execute on that feedback. And I just don't think he's been partnered with a driver that's necessarily been at his level and is able to drive a car at the limit in the way that he has. So when I see people making that criticism of Lewis, well, he's lucky he's had a great car. I actually think of that more as a compliment. Yes, he has a great car because he helped design it. He didn't
Mhm.
walk into a team that was already winning titles. He helped deliver titles to them because one, he was able to execute on the track, but also because he was a big, big piece of helping to design the cars that would ultimately carry him to those championships and carry Mercedes to those championships.
Yeah, I think that is definitely something that gets under discussed for both of those guys, honestly. But the one thing that I think both Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton have in common, and I think this goes for any of the great drivers across all the eras of Formula One. You could put them in a shopping cart and they would still be able to drive the wheels off of that thing because it may not be able to might not be the best car out there, but I mean we've seen it from Max so over the past couple of years. Yeah, it's been a good car, but it hasn't necessarily been a great car, and it definitely hasn't been a car that could match a Mercedes, very much like we've seen this year. And I think that Max has that's that, what do you want to call it, intangible quality of just being able to drive the car to the edge of the envelope and beyond. Lewis is one of those guys. Schumacher was one of the guys. Senna was one of those guys. I think we've even seen it with Charles Leclair. If you want to take another one of the current class of
Right.
Formula One drivers, these drivers are able to get every inch of performance out of these cars and even more. And it really is fascinating. And we've shown Lewis a lot of love for what he did at Sao Paulo this weekend, and rightly so. I mean, like you say, this was a performance for the ages, and this will be one that we'll all sit back and talk about at the end of the season next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And it really was something spectacular. But I think it was really interesting too. I just want to I'll sort of set this up a little bit, but I watched the sprint race on Saturday, and this morning before the race actually started, I went back and watched the highlights for the Saturday sprint race. It was 10 minutes long, and it was 10 minutes of pure action. And I mean, usually when you get like extended highlights of anything that's like 10 minutes long, there's a lot of filler in there, but there wasn't anything. But I think what was very interesting for me going into the sprint race on Saturday, you had Valtteri Bottas and Max Verstappen on the front row. Max just did not get a good start. Valtteri gets a good start, beats him into turn one, going through the Senna S, and then into Curva del Sol, into turn three. And that they just Max just didn't have that. He just didn't have it. He didn't have a good of a start. But on Sunday, it was completely the opposite. Max had a really good start. Bottas had a good start, but Max was better. He got more traction. And it was interesting too because they even remarked on it as the cars were coming up to the grid that Lewis was really, taking his time to get to the grid. And the cars at the front, their tires are getting cold. They're sitting there. But again, we saw a really brave, determined move from Max Verstappen. Wasn't reckless. He didn't push, take a real risk, or it was, anything that was foul. I mean, obviously later on that move with Lewis in turn four was, noted by the stewards and was obviously pushing the limits of fair play. I think that's a polite way of pushing it or putting it. But that move that he put on Bottas to take the lead on the first lap going into that first corner, I think again was very much like we saw last week in Mexico City. Brave move, outbraked him, picked his breaking point, picked his line through the corner. And again, I thought to myself, if this is, turns out to be Max's year and he wins this championship, that could be one of the moments, like very much Mexico. I mean, to me, it was just a really good move made by like incredibly good driver. And I thought this is the kind of thing that separates winners from losers. That's the kind of move that you see a champion make. And then, of course, he kind of, flipped it on its head, and then left me kind of cringing later in the race when, he pushed Lewis and himself both wide going into that turn four. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I'd like you to hear your take on that.
I think your analysis was really good. And I think we should probably also give Valtteri Bottas a little bit of credit, because I think I slandered him endlessly last Sunday and again on Thursday based on that start in Mexico City after he qualified on pole. But he was exceptional. He was absolutely exceptional in the sprint qualifying session today. I'll quickly provide some insights and some thoughts on the race as well. But I did find it really interesting that, and there's quite a bit of foresight in Christian Horner's comments here, but I took note of these quotes because I thought they would be good to reflect back on. This is Christian Horner speaking shortly after the sprint qualifying session. He says, Lewis Hamilton's sheer speed was mind-boggling. Lewis's straight line speed is just mind-boggling, he told Sky Sports. We've seen this coming for a few races now. In Turkey, it started to be there. In Mexico, we saw the straight line speed. I think they were about 14 kilometers an hour quicker at the end of the straights than we were, so it's no great surprise. We saw yesterday that it's phenomenal, he added, especially with the size of the rear wing that they have on their car. Revealing that the team's design guru, this article continues, Adrian Newey, had spoken with the Interlagos stewards. Horner said, it's something that is enabling the car to do that kind of speed. Something must happen because physics wouldn't allow. The kind of horsepower delta that you would need to achieve that would be pretty significant, he continued. So we're obviously trying to understand what it is and to go from there. Finally, he says, it's down to the FIA to police, said Horner. The rules are quite concise. They're ever more constricted. So I'm not sure if he's simply acknowledging the fact that we're seeing some really strong performance gains from Mercedes, especially in these straights, or whether he's inferring or he's insinuating perhaps that there's something greater at play than simply them finding some additional speed through some aerodynamic upgrades, and maybe inferring that there's something there from a power unit perspective. But I think the raw power that we saw from the Mercedes cars this weekend was simply phenomenal. And like Christian Horner himself says, we saw a little bit of this. It was teased a little bit in Russia. It was teased a little bit in Turkey. We saw a little bit of it perhaps at Coda, but for whatever reason, Mercedes were able to bring it all together this weekend. And I think one of the things that makes Interlagos so great, and it's funny, man, like a couple of years ago, we were talking about the end of Interlagos. We were talking about the fact that this race was done. It was dusted. They were moving the Brazilian Grand Prix to Rio. They were going to build a brand new track in Rio. Thank goodness that didn't happen. And I also can't help but think that the fact that it was renamed from the Brazilian Grand Prix to the Sao Paulo Grand Prix was largely to flex on the fact that Rio lost in their bid to steal the race away from them. But I think if there was ever any energy or efforts within that country to relocate the Formula One Grand Prix, I think it would be met with huge resistance from the world of Formula One because it was fantastic. But Mercedes looked fantastic. That top line speed that we all knew was there and we've all been talking about for some time was on full display. But one of the things that makes this track so special is, to me, it's like a go-kart track. It's very small. It's got 41 meters of elevation. You can see the track rise. You can see it fall. That's 120 feet for all of our American listeners that love when we do the translation for you. It's that, right? Like there's 3 feet to every meter.
Well, 1 meter is 3.28 feet.
So more. So let's say 150 feet of elevation. My math is terrible, but it was great. And it really looked like Mercedes had really dialed in that car for that middle sector. And then ultimately they were able to just deliver everywhere else. But to that point about Max, I think one of the things that he understands as well as anybody in the sport, and I don't say this to be disingenuous or to be sarcastic, but he absolutely recognizes the value of having clean air and being in front of the field, because it preserves your tires. You can go for a longer stint. You can dictate strategy. And he is not comfortable being in second or being in third or being caught in traffic. He can certainly execute when he has to, but I think he recognizes is that if there's an opportunity early in the race to break through and find that clean air out front, you got to do it, because he does not want to be in somebody else's dirty air. He does not want to be absorbing absorbing somebody else's engine heat. He does not want to be in that turbulent air. So he has consistently found a way to break through. And we saw that in Mexico City. And then sadly, we saw that today. And by sadly, I mean, I was hoping for a more competitive first couple of laps. And I was hoping that, Bottas was going to display a little bit of what we saw in the sprint qualifying session, which was some really terrific pace. But unfortunately, Max was able to break through. And I'm sitting there at that point thinking, well, the race is done. And then it quickly became a Red Bull 1-2 because Sergio Perez broke through as well. But ultimately, I would say that the performance from Bottas, even though he didn't win this race, was very, very strong. He did the right things from a team perspective, but Max looked exceptional early on. And I thought he was going to romp to a victory, but no criticism of Max for that early overtake, which I agree with you, was very clean and exceptionally well executed.
Yeah, I mean, it was aggressive, and there was no room for error on that. But I mean, he pulled it off, and I think that was just amazing. But just before we go into our break here, and we'll pick it up on the other side. And I was just thinking, again, you come down to the discussion is mostly about Lewis versus Max. This storyline that's been there all year long. But you know what is equally interesting is just the delta between Mercedes number one and Mercedes number two, Red Bull
Yes,
number one and
yes,
Red Bull
yes.
number two. It really is quite staggering. I mean, obviously those resources and the focus is going to go into the two championship protagonists, but I mean, it was something. I mean, you got to show a bit of respect to Sergio, because I mean, he did really put up a valiant effort to try and block Lewis and kind of run that interference between him and Max. And I mean, he did get past there at turn 4, I think it was. And then Sergio, being quite cheeky, comes back in the next DRS zone and takes the place back. I mean, it only kind of postponed the inevitable by another lap. But, you could tell, I mean, he was there, and he was really trying to, play that, that team role and do what he needed to do for Max and do for what he needed to do for Red Bull. Anyways, quick break. We'll be back on the flip side. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, everybody, welcome back. And just a comment from Steve Williams in the YouTube live chat. And Steve has to say, I feel like there's been so many moments this year that we have all said we will be talking about for years to come. We have been spoiled this season. And, I totally agree. I
Can I
totally
add
agree.
something onto that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the constant narratives from people this year, and I say people so vaguely and generally, it's a little bit dangerous because I'm notorious for that. But one of the comments that I've heard so much this year is that this is an all-time great championship. This is a championship for the ages. I'm just like, no, it's not. Like, it's good because it's close. I've really been uncomfortable with some of the vitriol and some of the negativity between this team LH camp and the team Max camp. I didn't like the way that some team principals, Christian Horner especially, were playing up some of this more, I would say, dangerous rhetoric in the media. But overall, I thought it was a good championship, but not a great one. I'm now evolving my position, or my position is starting to evolve, that after this weekend, I'm starting to agree that, yeah, this is actually becoming an all-time great championship. And if you backtrack and you look at the calendar year to date, it was in Bahrain, it was 1-2 in Imola, it was 1-2 in Portugal, it was 1-2 in Spain. Max wins in Monza. They both neither finish in the points in Azerbaijan. It's a 1-2 in France. It's a 1-2 in Austria. Max finishes first in Austria because of course they had two races. Then Lewis wins in Great Britain. Lewis finishes second in Hungary. Then Max wins in Belgium. Max wins in Netherlands, but Lewis is second. They both DNF in Monza for all the reasons that we know. It's a 1-2 in Russia. It's a 2-5. It's a 1-2. It's a 1-2. It's a 1-2. Like the degree of separation between these 2 years this drivers this year is, you think that you've got it figured out, that you know what, Red Bull's unlocked this downforce, this aero-driven downforce. They've got it locked up. And then all of a sudden, Mercedes has developed this top line speed, and you're, Mercedes has got it figured out. And then we go into Coda and Red Bull wins. And then we go into Mexico City and Max absolutely dominates. And then we go into Brazil, where we're expecting another Red Bull domination. And we're just hoping that for the sake of the championship, to preserve the championship, that Mercedes is going to be able to execute some degree of damage limitation, but all of a sudden it's Mercedes that absolutely romps in this race. And let's not forget that in the sprint qualifying session, Lewis could see Sergio
Mhm.
like that. That's how far he made his way through that field. That this championship is becoming something special, and I have to keep taking all that negative rhetoric and all of that Twitter noise, and I have to compartmentalize that and put that aside. Because if I look at the championship in isolation and I kind of put on the blinders, it's been a terrific championship between two world class drivers. And I love the point that you made a second ago. If you look at the deltas between Max and Sergio and the deltas between Lewis and Bottas, and then Sergio versus the rest of the field and Bottas versus the rest of the field. Like, let's be honest, Bottas is driving effectively the same car as Lewis, and Sergio is driving the same car as Max. They are not even in the same hemisphere of execution and performance this year.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's what I find so interesting. But I mean, just more to your point about the way that this season is really kind of boiled up to this, this crescendo. I guess is probably the way
Yeah,
that's
I
better.
like
It's
that.
really built up. I mean, it's been fun to watch Lewis and Max trade punches, basically right from Bahrain, right, way back at the end of March. But I mean, they aren't the only two guys that have been winning races this year. Sergio won a race. Esteban Ocon won a race.
Good
Danny
point.
Ricciardo won a race. Bottas won a race. So I mean, we've had six drivers win races this year. I mean, obviously Lewis and Max have won the majority, but I mean, there's been some great other stories in there. I mean, Perez's win in Azerbaijan was something special. Esteban's win in Hungary was something special. Ricardo's win in Monza was fantastic. It was completely out of left field. Nobody expected it, and I don't want to throw any shade and kind of downplay Bottas winning a race. I mean, unfortunately for him, it's the only win that he's likely to get this year. Whereas over the past several years, he's usually had a couple or several each and every year. I mean, there was that opportunity. Perhaps maybe he might be able to pull something off last week in Mexico, but I mean that was done by turn one, and then of course he ended up pointing the wrong way, looking down the track after that. But I mean, there have been so many great storylines this year, and it's just been fun watching. I mean, I think that if the way that you look at it, I mean, if Lewis wins the next two races and Max finishes second the next two races, I think if my math is correct, I think then we go to Yas in about a month and they'll be even on points. Which I mean, do you think that race back in 2016 for the title between Lewis and Nico was intense? This will be that battle on steroids. It will be absolutely epic. And I mean, add that to the fact that we're going to a Yas that is not a Yas Marina that we're used to. I mean, this profiled track, which kind of throws a bit of a monkey wrench into the work. I mean, all of these tracks that were coming up, and Lusail is brand new in Qatar next week. Then we're going to Jeddah and Saudi after that. That's a brand new track. I mean, and boy, is it going to be brand new. I mean, this is going to be paint is still going to be drying on the curbs by the time we get there.
So true.
And then we get to Yas Marina in just over a month time. And I mean, they're familiar with it, but the bank cornering, the way that this track has been reprofiled, I think is going to be really, really cool. And I mean, as we talked about, I mean, things do tend to favor Mercedes, at least on paper, but I couldn't help but thinking, when you were saying that, okay, we're going to Interlagos, this is going to be a track that's, still, at altitude, not quite as high as Mexico City, but still at altitude. So that should favor, or maybe not favor Red Bull outright, but definitely advantage of Red Bull. And it was completely unexpected what we saw from Lewis Hamilton. Like you said, they romped. Lewis romped all weekend long. I mean, despite all the challenges that he faced, and I thought that the language was very interesting because at the end of the race, you have the likes of Christian Horner and Max Verstappen talking about and using the term damage limitation because I think if you're a fan of Lewis right now, you're thinking this was a great weekend. We picked up so many valuable points. Whereas, if you're a fan of Max Verstappen, yeah, this wasn't the weekend that we were expecting, and we've conceded a lot of valuable points. But I think just in the broader perspective, now that we have these three races left as we head back to the Middle East now to close the season up, is that it could be potentially an epic ending to this year. I'm just hoping that number one, that neither of these guys has a DNF or has some unfortunate circumstances out on the track that denies us of this battle that we've been watching, and has been so enjoyable. I mean, apart from the time that Max parked his car on Lewis's lid at
Yeah.
Monza, that was
Yeah.
obviously a bit of a blight. And then obviously also the incident or sorry, not Monza, at Silverstone wasn't that kind of really triggered a lot of the bad feelings and things like that. But I mean, if these guys can just race, and I mean, I think after we saw it too at that turn 4 incident, I think maybe this is the perfect time to talk about it now. You heard Christian Horner on the radio to Michael Massey saying, let these guys just race. And you know let's be fair. I mean, Max was on the dirty side of the track, and perhaps that had something to do with it. I mean, no doubt he braked as late as he possibly could. I mean, there was a bit of desperation in that move. He went too deep into the corner. He pushed himself wide, and he pushed Lewis wide. Thankfully they didn't collide. Thankfully that didn't come to tears, because we'd be having a completely different conversation now. Like I think it was right that the stewards noted the incident. I don't think that it needed to go as far as to be investigated, but let's be fair. It was right at the absolute limits of what was an acceptable defensive move from Max Verstappen to preserve his lead there.
I was hoping you weren't going to pause because I didn't even want to necessarily address this because it's it's such a, it's such a minefield, this
It
conversation,
can be.
mostly because it's that kind of Max versus Lewis conversation, and it can ignite controversy. But I'm all for racing. And that exact quote, because I just looked it up while you're talking, that exact quote from Christian Horner was, Michael, that's all about letting them race. And I think this is that moment in the championship. And we see this sometimes in the NBA as well. And even the NFL and the NHL, where there's a point where the referees put away the whistles. It might be the
Yeah.
third quarter, the fourth quarter. It's a close game in the finals or a championship, and no referee, no sport wants to see a championship decided by a controversial call. And I think the FIA, in the role of the referee, has started to pocket the whistle a little bit. So maybe if this was Bahrain, or maybe if this was Australia in a normal year, maybe they do investigate this. And I'm not going to get too worked up about it, simply because it didn't ultimately dictate or
Mhm.
impact the outcome of the race. I'm agreeable in the sense that I don't recall him running that wide on any other lap. I also agree that he probably ran wide because if he tried to stay tighter to the racing line, he would have ridden the curb and possibly damaged the underside of his car or his front wing or the end plates, which we've seen consistently at this track over the years. It's also, and I'm not even going to get into the whole conspiracy theory piece, but it's also true that the stewards didn't have access to the camera that would have shown the position of his steering wheel in that moment. Did
Mhm.
he make an effort to turn in? Did he turn away from the corner? We don't know because we didn't have access to that camera. And maybe if it was there, it would have been a more conclusive ruling, or they would have decided to investigate it. But ultimately, I'm a big advocate for letting them race. And when we talked about Silverstone, you know what? I could have taken the penalty. I would have been fine if there wasn't a penalty. In Italy at Monza, when they ended up on top of each other, that was unfortunate, and the way it played out afterwards was horrendous, especially with the whole debate about should Max have gone and seen Lewis? Was Lewis good? Did he know he shouldn't have walked across the track? All of that noise was terrible. But
Mhm.
ultimately, to me, I would have been fine if that was deemed a racing incident. Here, it was a little bit flagrant just because he pushed him so wide, and we didn't consistently see that on other laps throughout the race. But I think for me, one of the things that the FIA and Liberty is going to have to get really straight going forwards is you are going to take this burgeoning US audience and you're going to confuse them, and you're going to frustrate them, and you're going to potentially turn them off if you can't be absolutely by the books when it comes to these type of calls. Like we talked about this all season with track limits.
Yeah,
You know what?
exactly.
There would be races where they didn't call it at all, or there'd be races where they would call it for one team but not another team. And there'd be races where, hey, we're going to call track limits in laps 30 to 50 but not 1 to 20 or laps 50 to 61. Like it feels like in many ways the FIA's been all over the map this year. So if this wasn't a racing incident, that's fine. Or if this was considered a racing incident, that's fine. But you have to be able to judge and adjudicate and litigate every instance like that with the same lens. And that's not what we've seen this year. So, again, I'm cool. Let's move on. It
Mhm.
didn't dictate the outcome of the race. But my point being, the FIA has to find a way to be more strategic, and they have to be far more consistent when it comes to adjudicating these types of moments. Because what I saw today was Michael Massey saying, we do not want the stewards to be influencing the outcome of a championship if there was no physical contact between these two cars. Hands off. No matter what Max did or didn't do, we don't want to be seen to be influencing the championship because we don't want to be wearing that label. That's the way I read this today.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I got some thoughts on that. We're going to take one final break, and when we come back, we'll just address that and much more. So don't go away. Okay, well, welcome back to the show. Just talking about that move, that blocking maneuver of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton later on in the race at turn 4. And when I say that I think it was at the limits of what was acceptable, I mean, I mean it from the point that I think that Red Bull did have some sort of defense to stand on, right? I mean, you could make the argument that he outbraked himself. I mean, well, I mean, then you have to have the awareness of your car and being responsible and keeping it under control. I mean, he was on the dirty side of the track. I mean, there was enough there. I mean, Christian Horner said as much that that it was defendable, basically the maneuver that Max made or however it played out, whereas Toto was saying the fact that it wasn't investigated, he wasn't punished, was laughable. I mean, those are reactions I think that are completely expected and logical from both Christian Horner and Toto Wolff. But you know uh, obviously we don't want to see the stewards get involved because like you say, I mean, because if they get involved in too many of these controversial decisions that influence the, or maybe not influence, but out and out affect the outcome of a race, then it becomes like a kind of a taint. Is like, okay, is this like are we watching like boxing in years and decades gone past? Like I mean, boxing sadly has that that reputation of being a little bit biased.
Mm.
Let's put it that way without being too incendiary. But yeah, I mean, I very much agree with your take there. But I mean, it would have been completely different if Lewis is trying to pass him on the outside of the corner and Max plows into the side of him and puts Lewis out of the race, and then say he limps around and just has to get a new front wing or something, where he collects points, increases his championship lead, and then Lewis collects a donut and retires from the race. I mean, that would be obviously a very, very different conversation that we'd be having this evening.
The other thought we should probably reflect on as well is subsequent to that maneuver at turn 4, a lot of Max waving about on the straights. And again, I
Mm,
don't want to anger, infuriate Max Army. But ultimately, that wasn't a good look either. The fact that there was so much movement on the straights, and people have been arguing that he was trying to keep heat in his tires. That's not how you do it at that point in a race with that amount of mileage on the tires. That wasn't a good look either. But ultimately, I appreciate from his perspective, there was some panic and there was some urgency, and he was looking to defend. And he probably saw what could have been a race, a championship lead of possibly 29 points evaporating before his eyes and rapidly becoming 14. But I didn't like that. In fact, I think I disliked that even more than that maneuver in turn 4. It was pretty convenient as well how quickly Christian Horner was on the radio with respect to that T4 corner. But again, my point here is I'm not necessarily going to put Red Bull and Max on blast because it's the FIA and it's Liberty that's allowed drivers to think that maneuvers like that are okay. And if they're not going to investigate it, and if they're not going to penalize it, we shouldn't even be talking about it because the
yeah.
sport, the governing body that adjudicates the racing that takes place on the track has clearly articulated that this is okay. But again, I'm of the mind that the FIA's got work to do from a consistency perspective. And also, furthermore, that because there was no physical contact between the two cars, they didn't want to be seen to be influencing the outcome of a championship with 3 races left.
Totally. Couple of things I wanted to talk about before we just jump into the mailbag. I know you got a couple of questions teed up there. One thing I always find, this is just sort of a comment of Lewis in general. I always say, love how he addresses the crowd, and obviously some races, some tracks, some countries are much more pro Lewis than others. And Brazil, they obviously really love Lewis at Sao Paulo. And I love how he always plays in the well, what a great what a great crowd, the fans here are great and stuff like that. And I mean, he knows how to play to people's sentimentalities, and you got to love him for that. I mean, he's always one to pay tribute to the fans. But I couldn't help but thinking that, if Lewis was a rock star, it's like, oh, nobody rocks like Sao Paulo rocks, and then like a week later, nobody rocks like New York City
Yes,
rocks.
yes.
It's
He's
that
like
whole
that rap star that rolls into your city wearing the hockey jersey on the
yeah,
stage.
yeah, yeah,
Like, yeah, I always knew he was a Seattle Kraken fan.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
no, he's playing it to the crowd. But Lewis obviously has an affinity for Brazilian fans
totally.
because of his passion and his love for Senna. And a lot of folks, and friend of the show, Kate, was messaging me tonight, and she was asking as well, like, what is the reaction to Canada when Hamilton comes through? And I'm like, it's always been very positive. He
Mhm.
thinks highly of the Canadian crowd. He's been successful there. A
Yeah.
lot of cheers. Because what I didn't like really in Mexico City and in Coda was the amount of booing that Lewis
Mm.
got. And if you want to cheer for a driver, that is awesome. Cheer your heart out. I don't think booing's necessary or required, but it was really nice to see in Brazil. And I saw some really great clips from fans that were in the crowd that, hey, Max drives by, there isn't a sound. There isn't a sound. It's like 2 a.m. in a quiet barn. I don't know if barns are quiet at 2 in the morning. But when Lewis drove by, they just erupted. And that was
Yeah.
nice to see, because I found it a little bit distasteful that in the last two Grand Prix, especially the race in Mexico, that there was so much booing for Lewis. And I get it. Like, we understand why there were a ton of Red Bull fans at Coda. I think people in the US really love to cheer for the underdog. And in Mexico, there was obviously that Sergio connection through Red Bull. So they were obviously the favorites. But I don't necessarily like to see the booing, especially if somebody like Lewis that has been so important to the sport. But it was nice to see that he got a little bit of love today, and he was able to deliver for a crowd and for a fan base that has obviously embraced him in the same way that he's embraced them over the years.
Yeah, was that also a reference to Snoop Dogg with the like the jersey, like on
Yeah,
stage? Yeah,
Snoop's one of those,
yeah.
definitely one of those.
All right. Let's take a look now at some of the other things that went on Sunday afternoon. Obviously, a big one was the fact, and we talked about it very early on in the show, the fact that we saw the Ferraris come home fifth and sixth, how that's kind of blown that's race, if you want to call it that, between themselves and McLaren wide open. Danny Ricciardo having a power unit issue with the Mercedes engine, and then Lando obviously having a puncture after he touched with Carlos Sainz going into turn one, getting the puncture, ending up at the back of the field there. Manages to score a single point, but this is one that a battle that we've been watching between these two teams for weeks and weeks and weeks. Ferrari has now opened up a little bit of daylight between themselves and McLaren going into the last three races of the season. And I'm not really too sure what to make about this, but I'm 100% that if you're McLaren right now, you've got to be concerned of what happened at Sao Paulo on Sunday afternoon, because this was not the weekend that they obviously expected, and obviously it's not the weekend that they wanted.
Yeah. One, I feel good about this in the sense that my prediction is coming true, and my predictions rarely ever come true. But during our mid-season preview show, I definitely called on Ferrari finding some separation, especially after they were able to install that power unit upgrade in both of the cars. And it was a staggered strategy when they finally did deploy it. But I think it's less
When did
that
they do that? Sorry to
Ferrari's.
jump in. Was that as far back as what was it? Belgium and then Russia? It was
Yeah,
a
I'm
Belgium and
sorry. I'm
about
just
two
bringing up the
months ago, wasn't
calendar.
it?
Yeah, and it wasn't all at once. I think the expectation was so it was announced during the summer break, and I
Yeah.
think they were pretty clear at that point that it wouldn't be available in both of the cars for at least the first three races after the summer break. But obviously, it's provided some additional boost and certainly helped their top line speed by as much as 10 to 15 kilometers an hour. Some people would argue less. But I think what's been more of a mystery to me, or what has been the mystery, is the lack of performance from, and not even just the lack of performance, but the lack of execution from McLaren. So if you look at the 8 starts that Ferrari has had since Turkey. So we're talking 8 combined starts from the two drivers over those those four races. They have 8-point finishes: a fourth, an eighth, a fourth, a seventh, a fifth, a sixth, and another fifth and a sixth. If you look at the combined finishes of McLaren over the same stretch of races, you have a 7, 13, a 5 and 8, a 10, a 12, a 10, and a retirement. Just collectively combined, they have really started to struggle, not so much since Monza, but maybe from Russia, because they had a double points finish in Russia, including I think a fastest lap. But they've really struggled collectively over the course of the last four races. And to your point, we're starting to see that reflected in the Constructors' Championship, because there's now that 31.5-point gap between the two teams. And I think with 3 races left, that might be insurmountable for McLaren at this point.
Yeah, it's certainly not looking good for them now. But I mean, it's really kind of interesting. I mean, just how relatively quick these things can turn around in Formula One, because you go away from Monza and the fabulous result that they had there, and then you go over to Sochi a couple of weeks later. I mean, Lando looking so good, and then everything unravels in those last couple of laps when the rain hits, and like
Yeah.
that whole mess that turned into. And since then, I mean, it's been a little bit hit and miss. There just hasn't been as much consistency. I mean, it seems like McLaren's been struggling a little bit to find their groove a little bit. It just seems like they're just not, they're just not all on the same page. Like the entire team. Obviously that's a bit of a simplification, but Ferrari is obviously, as you pointed out. I mean, the results, the stats don't lie. I mean, they've been quietly more consistent and been getting the better results, where maybe the focus is more on McLaren, because I think that win that weekend in Italy is still relatively fresh in our minds. And I guess at least from my perspective, that sort of translates well. They should be third in the championship, but they haven't really obviously performed to deserve that third place. And like you say, here we are with 3 races to go in the season, and that gap now between themselves and Ferrari may, in fact, just be too big.
We both recall that Charles Leclerc had, I don't want to say that it was a qualifying session from hell, because he ultimately DNF'd and ended the session, but he qualified on pole because of that, the weird anomaly that is Formula One qualifying. But he obviously didn't start at Monza. But aside from that, Ferrari has one combined retirement this year. So from a reliability perspective, they've been really strong. But
Hmm.
having said that, McLaren, Mercedes as well, just 2 combined retirements this season as well. So the struggles that McLaren are having clearly aren't reliability issue. That from a
Hmm.
design and engineering perspective, they've been really solid. And I don't think we would expect anything less, given the fact that they're running the ultra reliable Mercedes power units. But again, credit to that team as well, because they, of course, took a car that was ultimately designed for a Renault, which was actually designed for a Honda, and shoved a Mercedes power unit into the back of it. And of course, they were given a little bit more creative license with respect to what they could do to the car to accommodate that power unit. But yeah, it's been a bit of a mystery what we've seen from that team. And I don't want to speculate too much on what could be driving that, but I would love to see a little bit more of a challenge and a bit more of a battle between those two teams over the final 3 races.
Hmm.
It's just Qatar is going to be such a quick turnaround that I'm not necessarily sure we're going to see that. But that to me, and I've talked about it a lot this year, the 3-4 battle for me has been one of the most exciting ones, simply because positions 5, 6, 7, they're so far back in the championship. And I just know how much third place means to both of those teams. For Ferrari,
Sure.
it's strictly a pride piece. And for McLaren, it's a financial game, because they desperately need that income, that money to pay down debts and to continue to invest in the 2022, 23 cars.
Just before we move on to something else, I can't help but think to myself that Charles Leclerc, this is a guy that we've been talking about and heaping praise on for the past couple, going on several years now. Going back to when he broke into Formula One with Sauber Alfa Romeo, or maybe it was even still Sauber at that time when he started his Formula One career. But I mean, he's almost become a bit of a forgotten man this year. I mean, we don't really talk too much about Charles Leclerc. I mean, excuse me, it's not that he's Well, I mean, he just obviously hasn't had the car to challenge for races, and it's not like he's been, not getting out there and doing it. It's just that they just aren't in the position that they were a couple of years ago. And and I mean, when Charles is an exciting driver to watch, and the I feel like he's almost been a sort of a bit of an add-on, this year. It's sort of like, well, okay, this didn't happen, and then, oh yeah, Charles and Carlos did this as well. I mean, Charles Leclerc to me seems to have been a real sort of secondary source of news, if you want to put it that way. I mean, not really a name that pops up a lot to the top of the list. So hoping to see that turn around for next year.
Yeah, I very much agree. It was 2018. It was the first year I think that they were rocking the Alfa Romeo branding. It was still Alfa Romeo Sauber
Yeah,
F1 team back there before it became Alfa Romeo. He only spent the 1 year with that team. He was very, very strong. I remember he finished the season with a string of seventh place finishes in a car that probably had no business being that far up the grid.
absolutely
But
not.
he had a great first year with the Scuderia. Obviously, that year is tarnished due to no fault of his own, but because of the FIA findings that have remained very, very secretive, but he ran off that dramatic win in Belgium. He won at Monza in front of the Italian crowd, and
Which was
that was
epic.
amazing on
Yeah.
TV. He finished second in Singapore. He finished third in Abu Dhabi. Shockingly, he did still finish 2020 with that second place finish at Austria. But the year aside from that, and maybe a podium finish at the British Grand Prix, was kind of a write off. Some really strong points finishes throughout the balance of that season. This year, obviously, he had that second place finish at the British Grand Prix. But you're right, just given where he was in terms of prominence and in terms of capturing headlines, if we flash back to 2018 and 2019, he's definitely disappeared quite a bit. And that despite the fact that he's racing for a team that's currently sitting third in the championship. But maybe if you spin this a different way, maybe this just speaks to the depth of young talent in the sport, right? It's
Great
not
point.
just that, hey, we're discrediting him or he's done something wrong necessarily, but the sport is just swimming in great young talent right now, whether it's George Russell or whether it's Lando or whether it's Charles or whether it's Max. There's just a ton of really great young talent. It's not just this one that happened to break through in a field of 35-year-old veterans. We've got so much young talent, and that's a good news story. But I'm sure as Ferrari continues to develop that car, he'll probably return to more prominence as he fights for podiums.
Totally. Okay, let's jump into the mailbag now. So I know you got a couple of things. Where do you want to start?
Well, let me start with this one because I think it's a fun question and it's one we get all the time. It comes from our friend on Twitter, a loyal follower. His Twitter handle is at F1 person. He actually has Gen DTS in his bio on his Twitter account, which obviously warmed my heart because that's something
Solid.
that
That's awesome.
that we love. But his question for you specifically, well, it's not
Me
for you
specifically.
specifically, but I'm going to ask you specifically
The
is,
pressure.
hey guys, hopefully simple question, brackets Gen DTS. What is this bit? And it's a screenshot of a car showing the camera pod. In fact, it's the yellow camera pod, so presumably from Bottas's car. What is this bit? And is there any significance of one driver on a team being neon yellow and the other not being neon yellow?
I just assume it's a way to differentiate between the two cars. I mean, like in years gone by, like they would do different things on the two cars because obviously they have the same branding, the same sponsors and things like that. I mean, Nigel Mansell back in the day had the nickname Red Five because the Williams back in those days they had sort of a dark blue nose to the car, and they used to have like white numbers on them. And Nigel was five. His teammate Nelson Piquet, I think, was six, or was that Patrese? I don't remember at the time. But anyways, they put they made Nigel's number red, and he was known as Red Five. But you'd see that with they put like little fluorescent doodads and little markers on the cars. So it's just a different way to differentiate the two. I mean, it's a little bit easier for us at home. I mean, we're sitting here, we've all got like the 85-inch, 4K TV and everything like that, or some of us do. But it's a little bit easy because we have the opportunity to see the driver's number on the side of the car or the helmets or some the identifying marks. So I mean, if you're in the pits or up on the pit wall or something like that, and this car's screaming down the start finish straight or wherever you're looking for this car at 200 plus miles an hour, that's going to be a little bit easier to recognize that little fluorescent marking on the top of the camera than trying to look for the number, because you're going to be looking for the number. The cars are going to be three corners down the track.
Yeah, it's a camera pod. It's basically just where they mount cameras. The FIA uses them, the broadcasters use them, and you absolutely nailed it. The team designates one color for one driver. Typically, the neon yellow would be assigned to a secondary driver, and different teams have different criteria for allocating that. Maybe it's tenure with teams, maybe it's finishing the prior year's championship. It's less relevant. I think there was a point where it was important for viewers, but I think now that drivers have more creative license when it comes to the designs on their helmets. Sometimes it's easier to pick out a driver based
Yeah.
on the color and pattern and design of their helmet. Like that's clearly a Ricardo, that's clearly a Norris, that's clearly a Lewis. So it's a little bit easier, but that's basically what it means. Now, another question, and this is a really good question. And I was tempted to save this for Thursday, but we're only an hour 10 in. So maybe we can take 5 minutes for this one. This comes from eternally loyal listener, Zach. And he actually sends me this because he's probably sent it 5 or 6 times and I always lose sight of it. So I sent it to him a note saying, hey, remind me clearly. So he did. And it says, reminder for Thursday mailbag, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. So I actually had a question from one of your answers. Oh God, that means it wasn't a clear answer. You were speaking about the 2022 cars, mentioning that there are all sorts of possibilities in iteration to iteration between teams. Of course, 2022 being the year where we should see far less variation in design from car to car. What if all the teams step outside the regulations? I heard you guys
Mhm.
say there's the possibility that once we get to the reveals back in or next February, the cars don't even look like the reference model, or the cars won't look like the reference model. Obviously, there will be slight deviation from team to team. However, are you, from a seasoned consumer's perspective, erring to the possibility that the teams could take a little more creative freedom than allotted? Has this happened before? How do you protect or predict the FIA would respond to the teams take their creative interpretation too far? So again, I apologize for stuttering a little bit there. I think I'm going to need to get contact lenses at some point in the near future. But that aside, great question from Zach. So I'll let you take that one first. So basically, it's like,
Yeah.
hey, how daring do you think teams are going to be when it comes to aero design and aero philosophy next year?
Well, I think basically what it comes down to is functionality, right? I mean, what is going to be the most efficient way to get the job done? And the job done is to keep the car on the track and to punch that most efficient hole through the air, to get the car down the track. Now, I mean, there has been a lot of talk about like that all the cars are going to look radically different, or they're all going to look exactly the same, and it really will be different. I mean, this the reason why there's this much discussion about it is we haven't really we've never seen such a massive change in the formula. I mean, we've seen changes here and there. I mean, 2017 was the most recent one, but I mean, it was subtle compared to the massive changes we're seeing for next year's. But I think basically, at least from my point of view, is I think that it will come down to functionality and the parameters that they're required to work within. The car has to weigh X number of kilos. It can be so wide, it can be so long, it can be so high. This are the parts that you're permitted to have on the exterior of the car. These are the elements that can make up a wing. This is the elements that can make up a rear wing. All these different things, and that will be the real interesting thing, is that when we see that first reveal, be it Williams or Haas, it tends to be one of the the smaller teams that has the reveal first in and around Valentine's Day or beginning of February, and then they sort of dial up from there. But that first team is obviously going to get a lot of eyes on that launch. So that's why I kind of wonder this year, just being the fact that it is such a watershed milestone moment in Formula One, are we going to see a little bit of a difference? Because I mean, the big teams always seem to be the last couple of big reveals, and I think that as we see the first couple of teams launch, and then the discussion is going to be, after we've seen 2 3 teams launch, say, oh, these cars look exactly the same or they don't, and this is what these cars are different. And that's why it'll be fun to see, is that when the technical analysis comes out, that when the boffins get a hold of the pictures and everything, this is what Red Bull did compared to Mercedes, to get around this problem. So it's going to be really, really interesting, really fun to watch.
Yeah, I think this is going to be very interesting to watch. And I've heard a few competing pieces of information. One was from somebody that I stay in touch with at a team in the UK, and he indicated that it's been made clear to the team through Liberty, through Formula One, and through the FIA that the FIA will not be looking kindly on teams that are looking to really push the boundaries of what the regulations are going to be. That the FIA is going to be very strict about regulating the regulations from the jump, because the fear is that if they allow teams to push the boundaries too much early, it's going to be very difficult to get them back in line
Mhm.
subsequently. So there's this consideration that the FIA is going to be very, very, very strict when it comes to governing these regulations. But I've also heard from other sources in the UK, so not from a team specifically, but from other sources in the media, have told me that the FIA is going to allow some additional creative freedom next year, because they know it's something of an adjustment period for teams as they try to adapt to an entirely new formula. So I'm hearing these two
Mhm.
competing sentiments. Now, my sense is the right thing for the FIA to do, especially in kind of light of the conversation that I was having a few minutes ago about not being consistent with governing and regulating what happens on the track, is I think they need to manage this very, very closely. I don't want to see a championship next year where you have 6 or 7 teams that subscribe to the formula, they execute a new aero design and philosophy based on the formula, but 2 or 3 teams step outside of that and they're successful because of it, and because the FIA doesn't clamp down, because I think that will create a really ugly narrative, similar
Mhm.
to what we saw in 2009, where we had a couple of teams rocking double diffusers. Ultimately, the FIA governed that, or indicated that that was okay, but I don't want to be in a position where there's a shadow over the championship. So hopefully the FIA governs this very, very closely.
Well, I
One other
mean,
quick, oh, sorry,
sorry, I
please.
was just gonna say, just before you move on, I mean, I guess there is recent precedent when it comes to these things. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different, but the whole pink Mercedes thing with with Racing Point
Yeah.
last year, I mean, that's a little bit different about sort of the copying and have designing your own unique car. But I mean, that I mean, there is precedent there in what you can, what you cannot do, and what the boundaries clearly are. But I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, there are going to be certain parameters. This is what you can put into the car. The car has to match these basic dimensions and stuff like that. So it will be interesting to see when it comes down to the details how they work around some of these different problems. But that won't be any different than any other era in Formula One. It's just like I say, it is such a massive change in where we have been. So that's what makes it doubly fascinating going into 22.
Last question. And I'm
Sure.
not going to answer this one today. I'm going to save it for Thursday when we've got a little bit more time. But this question comes from Lewis, not Lewis, Lewis, but spelt what I would consider the French way, because it's a little bit
Louis.
more complex. Yeah,
Mhm.
perfect. So I probably just butchered that. But
That's
he,
my
he
Canadian
writes,
showing, eh?
he writes, "Hey, Mark, H, that is. Old OG Flasher here. I've never heard an explanation for what happened to Flash F1 and how the transition to this podcast happened. It's like, ultimately, as much as I loved Flash F1, this podcast has been equally as fantastic, if not more so. But I'm hoping to have an explanation of what happened and how this transition occurred." So that's a longer story. And Mr. Daly, if you're okay with that, I'll save that for the end of the next podcast, if that's cool. It's
That's
a cool
whenever you
story.
wanna
It's a
do
good
it, man.
story.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
whenever you wanna do it is fine with me.
cool. Awesome.
Cool.
That's all I got, my friend.
Well, I'm not gonna keep you any longer. I know that, you literally have to get on a plane, so, I'm not gonna keep you any longer because I felt so bad when you're like, "Dude, could we start, like, on time tonight? I gotta be
I
up at
didn't
4
say
AM."
that specifically.
No, I know, but I wanted to frame it that way because it sounds a little bit more dramatic and, this is Formula One. Everything's, a little bit more we try to pump it up a little bit, otherwise
I
it
like
sounds a
that.
little bit mundane and, less exciting. Anyways, thank you all for listening this week. I hope you enjoyed the race weekend as much as we did. As Mark just mentioned, we will indeed be back on Thursday night. Between now and then, if you want to get in touch, by all means do so. Send us a tweet at Scuderia F1 Pod. Send us an email at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. And behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, have a great week, and we'll talk again very, very soon. Bye for now.